Hello everybody and welcome back to the Public Sector Sales Podcast. I'm Jason Tussell and today we're going to be talking about selling to local versus central government. When selling to either of these, you can't paint both with the same brush. Each of these markets has its own quirks, nuances and characteristics which you need to be aware of when planning your sales strategy in the public sector. In this episode, we're joined by Matthew Walker, Technical Director at Executive Compass, to learn about all the differences between selling to local versus central government in the UK public sector. Matthew, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, for those who don't know, could you quickly just introduce yourself and what you guys do at Executive Compass?
Yeah, so my name is Matthew. I'm the Technical Director with Executive Compass. I'm part of the quality management team, working with the writers and the reviewers to make sure that we're consistently hitting a high standard in everything that we do. The organisation itself, we support organisations, both small and large, throughout the UK and occasionally overseas, to bid for public sector work with a higher chance of success.
Excellent, thank you very much. So today's topic, we're talking about selling to central versus local government. I think it's quite a common misconception, particularly amongst newer suppliers, people who want to breach into the public sector, that these different subsectors of a public sector can be painted with the same brush, essentially, that they have very common characteristics. Would you say that is wrong, and why is it wrong?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say there are quite big differences between the two, and it is quite important for bidders to understand those differences before they start working on their responses. Understandably, each buyer is ultimately self-interested. They're looking for what's best for them, they're looking for best value for themselves in the procurement decisions that they make. So you can understand for a local government buyer, a local authority, an NHS trust, a housing association, which is more, works more locally, we would expect them to have their own priorities and their own objectives at the forefront of their procurement decisions. So they might be implicit, they might be explicit within the standard documents, but to be successful, we do need to respond to those. Counterpart to that, when we do work on bids for central government, we'd expect to see much broader themes. There could be national priorities which are being represented there. And again, there's a bit of research that needs to be done by bidders to work successfully, particularly if they are new to central government procurement, to make sure they can, I don't want to say elevate, because it's not necessarily more complex, but just adjust the way that they work to respond to those different national priorities that a central government buyer might have.
So let's start on one half of this equation. What are the biggest misconceptions in your experience of when suppliers are trying to sell into local government? What typically do they misunderstand about local government? What kind of assumptions do they go into it with? What are the typical mistakes when approaching local government?
One of the really common mistakes is that a lot of bidders think that every local authority is fundamentally the same. So there will be similarities, there will be certain things which might make them comparable, but ultimately each of them will be looking for what's best for them. And all the different things which happen locally will influence what they perceive to be best value. So two neighbouring local authorities could have completely different objectives, completely different requirements, completely different needs based on their populations, based on the services they're specifically commissioning. All those different things should influence the way that a bidder responds to that invitation to tender. So yeah, a big common mistake that we do see is for a bidder to say, we've worked with local authorities before, we know what we're doing, we know we do a great job with Newcastle City Council, so we can apply the exact same when we're working with Tower Hamlets Council. Well, they're completely different places, they won't be looking for the same things. The experience of having one area can be used to good effect, but we need to think about how do we match up what we're going to do with the particular needs of that local area. So ultimately, there will be a much more localised focus when we're looking at local government bids.
Yes, so even if they're neighbouring, it doesn't mean they're going to have any, we'll have similarities, but they're going to be very different in terms of, like you said, demographics, what they value most, things like that.
Exactly, yeah. So we will see quite stark differences sometimes between authorities which, a potential contractor could say, we work already in this area, we want to expand our services, we'll do more of the same. Buyers aren't looking for more of the same, they're looking for something which responds to their particular needs and requirements. So yeah, that bespoking of bids is really, really important. And
touching on that, so you're approaching a particular local authority with the mindset, like we said, that each one is unique. We can't just paint them all with the same brush. How would you recommend that suppliers go about trying to understand that particular local authority? Where can they look? What questions should they ask? How do they get to know them, essentially?
There's a few things that bidders can do. The most straightforward thing is we look at the tender documents which have been issued in good detail, so we can really scrutinise the specification that could define the service outputs and outcomes. It could give a background to the commission, it could give a background to the authority. Key thing to remember there, though, is every bidder's got that document. Every bidder, every competent bidder is doing that work as well. So if we do want to stand out, we have to go a bit further. So there's a few things we can do there. One thing, the bidders who are most successful might have a little bit of prior knowledge of that opportunity. They might not be working completely reactively. I'm not saying they need to have already had a way in with that buyer, but at least they have a good idea of pipeline, so they know what opportunities are coming up in the public sector and they can start to prepare early for them. That preparation, it could be speaking directly to the buyer, because again, if you have that pipeline, you can speak to buyers before the tender is formally released. So in case anyone isn't aware, the PCR regulations, public contract regulations 2015, do stipulate that once a tender is live, communication with the buyer has to go through very, very select limited channels. Prior to the ITT being issued, obviously a lot of those regulations don't apply. So having that knowledge of what's coming on can allow for more effective communication directly with the buyer prior to the tender's release. Other thing we can do though is just to look at what's happening locally, to look at spend, to look at where value for money is being achieved, to look at maybe areas where local authorities might want to achieve savings, and we could look at how can our service deliver these system-wide efficiencies which could deliver best value for that buyer. So there's countless things that bidders can do. Key thing is anticipate the opportunity, prepare for it well, and make sure you do reserve that time to do the research rather than just jumping straight into answering the tender questions.
To go kind of against what we just said about painting local government one brush, one question that just came to mind for me is, are there any commonalities, any trends that we're seeing over the last few years or potentially over the coming few years as to what local government is looking for more and more in, say, bids, for example? Are there any particular pressures which, despite region, lots of local authorities are experiencing and that suppliers should be aware of? So for you, are there any of those sort of trends overlying all of central government?
There definitely will be, yeah. So we will see generally just a movement more and more towards social value evaluation within tenders. And when we come to central government, we'll talk about the fact that it is mandatory for central government buyers to explore social value. But for local government, we've seen the same move, whereby although they might have different priorities to each other in terms of what social value they want to see created in their particular communities, there is a general trend towards a greater focus on social value, and potentially even see that almost leaking into other aspects of the bid. It's not just isolated to the final question at the end anymore. They could be looking for that to be represented all the way through as more of a running theme in a lot of submissions. Alongside that, there's a lot of sector-specific complexities and challenges which might need to be represented. I know in health and social care, we would see, irrespective of the local authority, we'd expect to see a lot of questions on overcoming recruitment challenges, which I know are a key issue in that industry, or a key challenge to be overcome in that industry. And in all different industries and different sectors, we probably see a lot of the same, really, in terms of these different national trends or these different national challenges, maybe unifying these local government buyers a little bit in terms of what do they want to see from a high quality bidder. Having said that, equally there's a lot of very localised challenges as well, and we could see a bit of a mixture of both on most tenders.
So let's flip to the other side of the question now. Central government. So on the whole, compared with selling to local government, how does it compare to selling to central government? What are the key sort of characteristics of selling to local, central government? What things should you keep in mind as to how they operate and work, essentially?
I think a good way to answer that is to use that example of social value again, because on a local government bid, we'd look at a social value question and we'd say, how do we create value in these communities? And it's quite well defined in terms of what area are they looking for that impact to be delivered within. For a national contract with a central government buyer, it can be quite complex to look in that very, very particular way. And one key trend that we do see is a lot of the organisations who we work with on central government procurement could be bidding for places on very lucrative frameworks rather than sole supplier contracts. And that is a general trend that we do tend to see. Obviously not exclusively, we do also see bids with central government for sole supplier contracts too. But there is a big focus on CCS frameworks and those sort of procurements where it could be several lots, multiple bidders being appointed to each lot, and then multiple buyers calling off services from the various different lots. You can imagine the challenge that creates for a bidder organisation who wants to write highly specific, particular targeted responses. They don't necessarily know what the contract value to them is going to be because they don't know what work will be called off from the framework with them specifically. They don't know which buyers they could be working with. They don't know the local areas. So it does create quite a big challenge to bidder organisations bidding for these national frameworks if they don't know at that stage exactly what projects and exactly what work they might be delivering. So yeah, it can be quite challenging.
So touching on that, frameworks are an extremely important way of winning work in the public sector, especially in central government. For the sort of uninitiated, maybe newer suppliers, could you explain why frameworks, especially in central government, are so important, sort of how they enable or can enable more work to be won?
Well, there's a few things. I think don't quote me on this, but around 2010, a lot of it was a lot more centralised with the CCS framework. So previously, a lot of government departments would go to the market separately for all their different goods, services they might be looking to procure. Around 2010, CCS frameworks were established, which then centralised a lot of that procurement. What that means for bidders and suppliers is that if you're not on that framework, there could be quite a lot of closed doors to you supplying into certain central government buyers. Classic example of that, let's just imagine an office furniture supplier. Loads and loads of different government departments could be purchasing office chairs, desks and so on. But if you're not on the CCS framework, you could often find very limited opportunities to supply that. With a lot of these frameworks as well, they tend not to be open throughout their operation. They're not open throughout the lifetime of the framework. You need to bid for a place on them when they open and when they're established. And that might then have let's say, a 5-year duration. So again, there's a massive, massive incentive for suppliers to join those frameworks when they do open, because there'll be quite limited opportunities after that if they don't. Beyond that, I suppose it's just a very good way to then build relationships with different buyers. We do know of a lot of suppliers who might work collaboratively with a buyer to identify ways that works and services can be called off from an existing framework rather than necessarily needing to go through an intensive, laborious tender process again. So it could just be a good way to build those relationships with diverse central government buyers as well.
If I recall correctly, I think it actually said in the recent sourcing playbook published by the Cabinet Office or CCS, one of those two, that the government's preferred route to market for a lot of different types of services products is frameworks.
Yeah.
So they've explicitly said in this market, frameworks are a preferred route essentially.
Yeah. Which makes sense because, again, you can imagine all the different government departments purchasing stationery. It'd be so inefficient for them all to be doing that separately. If they can establish a framework, get a good pool of suppliers together, and then different departments just call off contracts from that framework, obviously it leads to a much more efficient process for everyone involved.
If we could pivot back actually to local government on the topic of frameworks, as we know, as we just discussed, frameworks are very, very important. On the whole, how does the use of frameworks in local government compared to the use of frameworks in central government? Like you said, local government doesn't have, perhaps in the same way, an organisation like the CCS, where the frameworks are more centralised. So do you see any differences in the use of frameworks between central and local government?
We do see some differences, and it is a little bit more centralised around frameworks, I'd say, within central government bids. But we do see purchasing organisations which might be acting on behalf of groups of local authorities. NEPO being a good example, the North East Purchasing Organisation, representing 12 local authorities in the North East, and then YPO and ESPO and various other purchasing organisations around the country. So we do see those same sorts of processes being applied, whereby rather than every single individual authority going to the market individually to try and purchase those goods or services or those works, they can group together. And again, it puts that big focus on the importance of this one bid. It becomes a must-win bid for a lot of organisations, because if we're not successful here, it could be 12 doors closing rather than one for that framework term.
What kind of, talking about both local and central government, what kind of data can you be using to determine which frameworks are worth your time applying for and getting onto, essentially? Because there are hundreds of frameworks out there. Some of them promise the world, and then ultimately they don't deliver much at all. So what is it, both in local and central government, you could be looking at to determine which frameworks you should be applying for?
Well, we do look at framework spend. That is one of the key reasons that we use Tussle, is to look at framework spend and identify on behalf of our clients or together with our clients which frameworks could be the most lucrative to them. We've seen the exact same situation where a framework manager might establish what the framework could mean in contract value, but until the framework's established, they don't know specifically which buyers may or may not use that framework. Best thing to do is look retrospectively. So say if a framework's up for renewal, or if it's up for retender, we could look at what has spend been like from that framework. We can look at which different authorities are using that, and that can help a supplier identify different routes to market via those various frameworks. So we'd always look at what has spend been like historically.
So on that, to circle back to the idea of data and context, when you're selling into central government, what places and sources should suppliers turn to when trying to understand what particular nuances and pressures each government department, executive agency, body are experiencing, and then how can they use that to write more compelling bids, essentially?
I would say that the more the bidder organisation does, the better. So as much research as we can do is advantageous. And I appreciate there's time pressures with any given bid, and there will be restrictions on how much can be done. But we do see a big payoff when that research is undertaken. So Service level, absolute minimum, we need to look at the tender documents and really understand them. Big mistake that a lot of bidders make. We know what we're doing, we've done it 100 times before, we can just jump into answering the questions. Really look at the tender documents. They will give you a good initial steer on the background to the service, the background to why it's being put out to tender, what needs it's designed to address. Beyond that, what else can the bidder organisation do? We'd always say look at anything else which is being published by that buyer organisation. So they'll have policies, procedures, strategy documents. They might have a 5-year corporate plan that's been publicised. That could talk about their targets. Really key thing in there, could talk about areas where they're not currently hitting targets, and that can help a bidder organisation to identify key areas where they can add value. We can look at where money's being spent elsewhere by that organisation. That can help them identify areas of most need. So maybe the added value and the social value that they can deliver can link more specifically into the areas where that local authority is looking to achieve certain outcomes. Colleagues within the organisation, I think a lot of the time people underestimate the importance of knowledge they hold within their own organisation. So, just conversations that contract managers might have had day to day with different team members at the purchasing authority, that can be really impactful as well. So just capturing as much information as possible, both qualitative and quantitative, does make a big difference when bidding for that local authority work.
I'll ask you the same question I asked about general trends on local government. Mm-hmm. Again, going against our principle of not painting everything with the same brush, but I'm going to do it anyway. Are there any general trends you've seen across central government over the last few years that you feel are important for suppliers to be aware of when writing bids, when engaging conversations? What are we seeing in the bigger picture essentially across central government?
The most important thing from my perspective is that although local government does ask questions on social value, we would expect to see on average a weighting of around 10%. It's mandatory in central government. Yeah. So any bid which is above the threshold, which I believe is around £140,000 for central government bids for goods and services, by law, that buyer has to ask a question on social value with a weighting of at least 10%. Beyond that, there is a social value model established by central government which has to be applied, unless there's a particular reason not to those procurements. So we do see a lot of similarities now in bids for very different services which are being procured by central government buyers, whereby they're applying that exact same social value model across the board. So again, top tip we'd say for any bidder organisation is to study that social value model. Look at the key priority areas, look at the way that it needs to be reported and the metrics that might be used. Really understand that. If we don't achieve a high score on that 10% weighted social value section, it's really complex and really difficult to make up that shortfall in the other areas. So yeah, social value would be the big one for me.
So to wrap up then, what for you are the key 3 differences, if you had to distill it into 3 key differences for suppliers between selling to local versus central government? What are the 3 key things that they should be aware of?
There are so many differences, but 3 which immediately come to mind. First of all, we would say that there's a big focus on localisation within a high quality local authority bid, which seems obvious, but the local priorities will differ from national priorities. So we need to make sure that we understand what that particular buyer's priorities, objectives, aims are, and we can tailor all the responses to that. Again, all the responses, not just where it's asked for, but making sure that we're proactively finding ways that those ways of working will link into the achievement and securement of those different aims. We'd also say that with the central government bid, the tone might just be a little bit different. We do tend to see a slightly more strategic focus in those questions. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a higher bar to be successful with those bids, but it's just a different mindset, I think, in the evaluation processes for a local versus central government bid. So we'll see that in both, but we do see a little bit more tipped in the favour in a central government bid towards those slightly more strategic, higher level questions which are being posed. Third thing that comes to mind for me is that when we see a central government bid, there can be a little bit more restrictive in terms of the formatting that bidders are permitted to use. So within a local government bid, where we can, we'd be keen to use diagrams, images, tables, use of colour to give it a nice visual impact, all those key things. We're not saying that we can't do that in a central government bid, but we do always check the guidance, and as a general trend, we do see they're a little bit more focused on 6,000 characters to go into a text box, and that might be in the interest of fairness or maybe trying to make sure it's a very level playing field for those national bids. But it's something that bidders need to be mindful of. I'd say when you are working on a local government bid, do jump at the opportunity to apply a little bit of creativity and to give a good look and feel to your responses. Whereas a central government bid, check the guidance, but make sure that if they are a little bit more restrictive in that regard, you do work in line with the rules that have been laid out.
Okay, no pretty pictures for central government then?
Fewer pretty pictures, we'll say.
Fewer pretty pictures. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. That was all very informative. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Public Sector Sales Podcast. If you want to listen to more episodes, head over to our YouTube channel. If you want to keep up to date with all our latest episodes and bits of content analysis reports, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. If you want to learn more about the tender and bid writing support that Executive Compass can provide, head over to our website. And if you want to learn more about us at Tussle and our market intelligence platform, head over to tussle.com. See you next time.